Şimdi tüm hızıyla devam ediyor. İkinci panelimize geçeceğiz. Programımıza Kibar Holding sponsorluğunda düzenlenen Küresel Gündem paneliyle devam edeceğiz. Ben alkışlarla sahneye CNBC Strateji Katı Programı sunucusu ve danışman Doktor Ceyhun Emre Doğru'yu davet etmek istiyorum. Ceyhun Bey burada mı? Sanıyorum ki kendisi hazırlanıyor. Ceyhun Bey hazır değil mi henüz? Evet, alkışlarla Ceyhun Emre Doğru hazır. Buyurun efendim. Hoş geldiniz.
Hoş bulduk.
Bana listleri siz anons edersiniz herhalde.
Buyurunuz. Third place. Efendim herkese güzel bir gün diliyorum. Küresel Trendler paneline hoş geldiniz. Küresel trendler olduğu için İngilizce devam edeceğim. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this Global Trends panel at the International Corporate Governance Summit. In this panel, we are going to dive deep into probably one of the most strategic but also challenging issues that the boards are facing across the globe. And that is, of course, talent and future of workforce. So I think that we all agree that these are not ordinary times. The world is going through a fundamental transformation, and that surely has an impact on the workforce and the talent issues, right? So the technology is changing how people are working, how the businesses are governed and managed. Of course, employees, they have different expectations from corporate leaders, and of course, corporations have different expectations from their workforce, such as reskilling to remain competitive. So long story short, I would say that talent is no longer just an HR issue. Surely, it's a strategic matter to be discussed and decided at the board level, and that's exactly what we're going to do here today. That being said, a recent research that I was looking into really demonstrates the importance of how boards are managing the talent and workforce problems. So 84% of the global boards are saying that talent and workforce is in their top 3 priorities. However, only 24% are saying that they're fully prepared to address talent and workforce issues. So surely there are new challenges, new questions to be answered by the boards and board members. So those questions might be, how are we going to create a strategy to have a workforce and a talent strategy to create long-term value? Or are we going to properly manage the impact of an AI on our workforce? Or maybe questions like, can we reskill or upskill our workforce to remain competitive in these changing circumstances? So to answer some of these questions today, I have very distinguished guests. You know, we'll hear from voices from Europe who are shaping the corporate governance landscape in Europe from institutional perspective, from investors' perspective. So I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists. I would like to start with Pavle Juric, who is the Senior Counsel for Corporate Governance at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. So he brings a unique legal perspective and policy lens to how boards in emerging markets especially respond to fast-changing talent environments. On the left side, Raitis Ambravizicius, welcome, Chairman of ECODA and President of the Baltic Institute for Corporate Governance. Raitis is deeply engaged in advancing board effectiveness and talent oversight across European markets. And Roger Barker, Director of Policy and Corporate Governance at the Institute of Directors in the UK. Roger is a widely respected authority on boardroom dynamics and governance reform. And of course, last but not least, Jen Sisson, CEO of the International Corporate Governance Network, ICGN, representing long-term institutional investors, and Jen offers the critical perspective of how human capital is now viewed as a material governance issue globally. So I would like to welcome you all, and thanks for being here. So I would like to start with you, to really understand the talent and workforce issues that we are facing and the boards are facing in Europe. So across the European markets represented by ECODA, how our board-level discussions are evolving towards a more human-centered approach, and what the companies are supposed to be doing in this fast-changing landscape?
Thank you. Actually, we have to start a little bit, go back, some 10, 15 years ago. And I would say that comparing with today's situation, life in the boardroom was really much, much easier now these days. Not anymore. And I predict that it will never be as good as it was some time ago, right? And the key word here, I would say, is uncertainty. And I think that majority of you living in this great country of Turkey are somehow directly or not directly related to the sea. And I can provide some example from the sea because I'm myself sailor. My father was a sailor, and I used to sail in these waters as well. So when you have a so-called champagne sailing, you are so good captain, and your crew is so good. But, sea is unpredictable, and any moment you can get a really very strong winds and very big waves. And then it will be not only about your sailing vessel. It will be about your crew. How this crew will act and react and will do anything what is needed. So actually we are now, at least in Europe, but I believe that almost in every country in the world, we are really in the big storm, and nobody knows when it will end. So it means that the boards are turning back to the resilience of the company, and resilience could be ensured only when the people in the organization are really committed, engaged, loyal. They feel that they are part of this organization, and so on. So one of the current tasks that we are doing at ECODA, European Confederation of Directors Associations, is a revision and update of, we call it People Governance Charter. And actually these updates that we are working on are very much related to the board's responsibility towards organization, towards people. For example, we know a lot that people now are working from the distance, at some few days in the office, few days at home or whatever, and this inclusiveness and belonging to the organization, it really becomes a very, very important. So this is one of the topics. Then, if you will read carefully G20 OECD principles of corporate governance that we updated recently. So you'll see that the remuneration and all the motivation according to these principles should start and stop on the top executive level. But we at ECODA think that the board has to engage itself also into the designing remuneration of the whole organization, of the whole employees and so on. So there are so many different changes that we have to address in the current circumstances. There is one more thing that the boards themselves, I mean the shareholders, the nomination committees, that they are reviewing the composition of the boards currently, and quite often we see that there are some changes. Either the changes with the same amount or number of the board members, or even expansion of the boards, because we see that we need more competences in different sectors, much more competences that, let's say, 5 years, 10 years ago. 5 years ago, cyber on board agenda was not present, I believe. Now you cannot have this, I mean, cannot not have this. So you must have this, and so on. And the same with the organizational development. We even had a very interesting discussion recently on ECODA, on the board of ECODA, that the question was very simple. who leads the organization, who leads the organizational culture, who builds the organizational culture, who is the kind of key person or persons, whoever. And actually, it was very interesting discussion because some of the people at ECODA said that it's a CEO. Why? Because CEO is at least 8 hours, usually it's more hours a day within an organization.
On a day-to-day basis.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. No objection. But others, including myself, were saying, no, the board is responsible for this. Why? And I can give you an example from my own experience because I'm the board member and chair for many years. Because when you are coming to an organization, learning this kind of from inside that organization, you feel that, and looking to the CEO, you feel that, you know, you have a question for yourself first, internally. Is that person is the best person you can find in the market in order to drive this organization, you know, up and to greater success. And at least in my career, I had 2 cases when after some half a year or so, while learning about, you know, deeply learning about the organization, I was kind of proposing to my fellows around the board, you know, table that shall we think about the replacement of the current CEO, and it ended up with a replacement.
And what exactly made you think that?
Sorry?
Like, what kind of indications have you seen to?
Actually, it was the kind of overall feeling that the organizational culture is not the best it can be.
Okay.
Because when I was kind of serving in the top executive positions, I was kind of trying to build this organization in this way, but we can talk about this later. And I was feeling that, you know, when you have been doing this by your own while being in the C-level or CEO position, so you more or less know how it should be, and if it is not, then you are trying to understand why it is not, and then maybe it's the best way to change. But the most interesting thing that the last case was that when we changed the CEO after some 3-4 months, some of his former subordinates that were still within the company, they said, "Thank you." So we were right. And of course, the organization started to change, you know, develop, not kind of money-wise, of course, the results were following, but kind of feeling was very different. The atmosphere was very different. So that is the core that you know we are really focusing on the resilience once again, based on the engagement, inclusiveness, you know, of the whole organization. And those companies that will manage to build this resilience, thanks to organizational development, then they will survive. Those are not, nobody knows what will happen with those.
So coming back to your previous analogy about sailing, so it's important for the board to create the right crew who will steer the company towards the right direction, especially through challenging times.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. So Jen, I would like to ask you, what do investors think about the relationship between corporate governance and the human-centered management, and what your organization is doing to advocate that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me. This is my first trip to Turkey, so I'm very pleased to be here and look forward to coming back. It's brilliant to be discussing these kinds of issues. And I think, you know, one thing we would say at ICGN, we represent investors from all around the world. So pension schemes, asset managers, and, you know, all with a view of focusing really on driving good practices of corporate governance and high standards of investor stewardship, because we think these are absolutely crucial long-term value drivers, right? And so there's no one answer to what does this need to look like everywhere in the world. There are local issues, but while governance tends to be very local to the company, local to the market you're operating in, you know, investment capital is global. And so we do see quite consistent sort of minimum expectations of what investors will expect boards and companies to do. And then how they play that out and manifest that in their individual company is really the art of being a good director for that company, rather than what is good governance overall. But, what I would say is we at ICGN set some global principles of good governance, and they have been contributed to the OECD principles, for example. We use them to help us to advocate with governments and standard setters around the world, and they lay out the core expectations. What is really the principle that we're trying to encourage boards to think about how to apply? And there's probably two core areas, I think, that are important when we think about people. First is oversight of culture, and second is oversight of human capital management. And so I would completely agree with the point there that the board is responsible for culture, and the board does need to be responsible for making sure the right frameworks around human capital management are in place. Now, the board isn't going to do that themselves. That's what the executives are for. But really having that agency check and balance is important for investors, because most investors are minority investors in any company, whether that's a debt position, an equity position, public or private markets. And so you need the board there to act as your agent, as shareholders, right? To keep that check and balance on management, to be that constructive challenge we just heard about in the previous panel, right? Well, I don't want someone who's easy to get along with necessarily. We want to be making sure we're asking the right questions. So what are those things that investors want to see? Well, good workforce engagement. How are we listening to what's actually happening on the ground in the business and thinking about that and reflecting on it in the boardroom? How are we making sure we're taking care of people's basics, human rights, health and safety, right? Let's make sure we've got the right frameworks and controls and processes in place. Similarly, whistleblowing is really important and a good measure of culture. So is the board aware if there are problems? Have they created those channels for people to safely say, hold on a minute, I've seen something that doesn't look right? And is the right protection there that they won't be retaliated against? And then, on the talent management, I would completely agree again. It's about succession planning. It's about training, development, especially in the world so rapidly changing with technology, but also that performance management and reward process. And actually, if you think of some of the big governance scandals we've had in previous years, right? Mis-selling issues, corruption issues, they are often driven by poorly structured mid-level management incentive plans. And so making sure that the remuneration committee doesn't need to write the structure. This is different than CEO compensation, but they do need to understand, what are we incentivizing and why? How does this link to our long-term strategy? And are we giving our people the right tools in order to achieve that well? And so I think my overarching comment as an investor would be, what you are doing, how you implement talent management, human capital management, board oversight of these issues needs to be driven by what is your strategy, what is your business model, because this isn't going to be the same for every company. And then from an investor perspective, what are the right key performance indicators here? What are the drivers of value that are going to tell me whether management is getting this right? Is the board monitoring them, and how are you reporting on that transparently? So I think those would be universally true investor desires everywhere in the world. It's certainly, and we're going to talk about this later, not perhaps consistently done everywhere in the world. But the real question is, how do you take those baseline expectations and needs and translate them into your business?
So would it be fair to say that corporate strategy, governance, and culture, they should all be interrelated and they should support each other from an investor's perspective?
Yes. So from an investor's perspective, investors invest in companies because we'd like you to make money, please, right? And grow over time and be worth more and have that long-term value. You can't do that unless you have a sustainable strategy. And we heard it over and over. It's certainly true. Human capital is often the company's most valuable asset. So if it's not part of your long-term strategy, I would suggest that's a big concern for your investors.
Thank you. Now I would like to turn to Pavle Juric and to get the perspective from EBRD side. And I would like to ask you, how does EBRD encourage this human-centered corporate governance practices, mostly in emerging markets, but also in other markets as well for the companies that it engages?
Thank you very much, and I don't know if you can hear me well. Yeah, so first of all, really thank you. It really is a pleasure and a great honor to be with you again, because I've had the pleasure of participating at the previous conference too. So yeah, I think very much similar to what Jen said in some ways, but in some other ways quite differently, because we obviously are a development finance institution. We are active mostly in emerging markets and in frontier markets. So I think that's quite a difference compared to ICGN. We obviously, as an international financial institution, have a mandate to improve the economies where we invest in, to primarily invest in the private sector with the aim of making these markets over time really fully functioning, open economies. And this is something that is reflected in our ways of investing, in our logic as investors. It's primarily described through a set of qualities, what we call so-called transition qualities, that we want to encourage or to advance through basically every single investment that the EBRD makes. And actually 2 of those are well-governed and inclusive. So they're descriptions of the behaviors that we want to see, the change that we want to effect in the companies that we invest in. Now, maybe just, again, as a bit of context, we provide not only equity investments, but also different kinds of debt investment too, so investing in bonds. And we cover not only listed companies, but pretty much from SMEs all the way up to listed companies and to major financial institutions. So the breadth of practices that we get to see is quite diverse and quite broad indeed. I think on this particular point, managing of human capital, from our perspective, for many emerging markets, and by the way, when I say emerging markets, I don't necessarily mean Turkey. I think Turkey is one of the more advanced markets that we operate in, especially the kind of listed company segment, but further down below, those are typically closely held companies. So either fully private or companies that are in kind of controlled ownership context. So in many of those, you still have the issue that the board's role and the board's position in the company is still quite often misunderstood, meaning the board isn't really seen, if it exists, is not really seen as a kind of strategic central body, the main kind of driver of both the business direction and governance practices. It tends to be more focused on oversight, but very formal oversight, the kind of oversight that you would exercise if you did not have a role in setting the strategy. So in a way, in many cases that we look at, the first step is to actually approach the company and to try to explain this is what the board should be doing. And if primarily it starts with the strategy development, formulation, and then it moves on to kind of to oversight and to seeing how it's developed. And in all of these steps, we think that human capital management is very important, but it just takes a bit of more effort to kind of sort out the basics, if you will, that the board really is, has all of these roles, and that this is one of the issues that it needs to.
Do you face resistance when you approach and explain this kind of things to the boards?
Well, that's another thing, yeah, that we can mention.
Cultural maybe barriers. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, culturally, I think even the previous panel had this as a topic. I think you do face some sort of notion or misconception that you as the owner are in charge and whoever is the board member is just meant to make it happen smoothly. I think, obviously different contexts and different individuals require different solutions, but the way we try to approach it as an investor is really from a value-added perspective, and that is trying to support those activities that could help this board to become more professional, more kind of in tune with what the company needs to do, to understand what the company's strategy will be and what are the challenges along the way, and then to find, both in terms of board composition, but in terms of organizing the workforce further down, the right mechanisms and the right people that will carry these initiatives. So this is one of the very really important points that the board needs to understand, basically, first of all, its role, but then its operating context. Once we get to do that, and once we have an understanding of how the company is structured, you know, where we want to take it and what are some of the governance changes that they want to do in order to keep developing, then there is a whole range of, I would call them, policy or advisory activities that we can take in cooperation with the companies themselves. So we do, as I said, pretty much a kind of analysis of their governance practices and find potential areas for improvement. But we can also do more specific things, such as around board dynamics, you know, board composition, planning, structuring some kind of nomination policies and processes. We can do, of course, board effectiveness reviews. Further down in the organization, we do what we call equal opportunities action plans. So basically going into the workforce very closely, looking at how are the equal opportunities treated. So both men and women in the workforce, are they getting enough opportunities for career progression, and the right kind of conditions for working, the sort of, you know, the pay gaps and all of that. We also very much look at career progression and also succession planning, something that we unfortunately do not see in many boards in practice, but something that could be immensely helpful in
Spatial succession planning, as I understand.
Especially succession planning, I think, you know.
There's even a TV show about that.
Given where most boards are, at least the ones that we tend to work with, this is something that's still somewhat of a blind spot, especially beyond, you know, further deeper layers of management. So it takes a bit of explaining to them what this may mean for the company, for their own talent management a few years down the line. And it's also a way to kind of motivate staff to try and really nurture the people that have been identified as talent. But unfortunately, in many of our countries, this is not something that happens regularly. So then when we do step in as either a shareholder or a loan provider, it really carries immense value to the companies, because it's all done from a perspective of making them better and not necessarily just less riskier. And of course, I mean, just to add, in all of this, we really need to rely on kind of the ownership by the board. So we do, our primary contact point when negotiating transactions is, of course, management, but we also need to have a very clear understanding of how firmly the board is really pushing for this and how engaged they will be in the company once these activities are, you know, essentially agreed and decided as the way forward.
Thank you. So to you, Roger, obviously, I mean, at the beginning we discussed about the rapid transformation in the business landscape, and of course the companies are trying to catch up with that. But of course there are some, you know, short-term issues and long-term issues, you know, and talent really plays an important role in that. So how can companies balance that short-term competitiveness with long-term value creation when it comes to talent and workforce management?
Yes, well, great to be here, by the way. I think, you know, as with any important issue, there's a short-term dimension and there's a long-term dimension, and boards have to navigate both. You know, what one is, some people sometimes speak in terms of the long-term being all important. Well, it is incredibly important, but so is the short-term, because, you know, if we don't manage the short-term, we won't be here. And when I look at UK companies, there have been some really big short-term issues relating to human capital, talent management, coming out of the pandemic, because we've experienced very significant labour shortages and skill shortages, and they're still very much with us. And that I think is giving many boards and also government policymakers significant pause for thought. But what I think the board can bring, really though, in a more fundamental way, is a long-term approach to talent management, you know, and really looking at it from a strategic perspective. And I think there are two ways it can do that. And the first is a very basic way, but I think it's probably the most important thing that any board ever does, and that is choosing the right CEO for the organization, the right management team. You know, this conference is all about human-centric management, you know, and that's about having a culture which has empathy, which cares about well-being, which puts the individual at the heart of things. Now, if you have a CEO who just doesn't care about that kind of stuff, you're not going to get anywhere as an organisation. I do think actually we don't think about these more psychological issues enough, probably, in governance, because you know, if ultimately you have someone running an organisation who is, you know, essentially a narcissistic individual, has all manner of personal flaws, is borderline psychopathic, you know, you're not going to have a human-centric organisation if someone like that is running it. And if nothing else, a board, a governance framework, has to somehow find a way to prevent that happening. So, you know, that's the first thing the board can do. The second thing, I think, you know, the board can build a talent management approach into its strategic framework. I mean, there are some boards nowadays in the UK that have appointed chief people officers to the board or to the executive team. Some have subcommittees to look at human capital. So that, you know, those are ways in which, you know, the board's focus can be increased. One of the ways that boards, which really, I think, have tried to develop the right sort of culture in organisations to foster human capital, has been through so-called DEI policies. We call them ED&I in the UK. In the US, they're called DEI. And they mean the same thing: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Unfortunately, the problem at the moment is that this whole area has become very politicised, particularly due to the political debate that's happening in the US, which is a shame, because ultimately I think these policies were not political in nature. They were simply a whole series of policies aiming to maximise the potential that an organisation has in terms of human talent, and making sure you're finding the right talent. You're not overlooking certain groups of people due to their background. So that, I think, it's something which should really enhance the performance of an organisation. And we polled our members in the UK, the members of the Institute of Directors, and we found that actually they agree with that 70% of them are not going to be changing their DEI policies. 70, more than 70%. But it's a very different matter if you look at any companies which are somehow involved with the United States. Maybe they're doing business in the United States. Especially with the US government, they're having to make changes to these policies, and they're having to say, you know, we're not going to pursue them, or we're going to fundamentally change them. So that, I think, it's very important in the midst of all of this uncertainty that we're facing at the moment, for boards to just sit back and think, what is in the best long-term interests of our organisation? What really makes sense? And don't have a knee-jerk reaction to all the current turmoil. Think about the longer-term perspective and what we're trying to do. And so my final point would be that probably the biggest transformation that our organisations are going to be facing in the coming years is how we adopt AI, you know, and how we apply technology to our businesses. And what we have found in other surveys that we've done of our members is that actually the biggest blocker to really taking advantage of that are skills. Skills at the board level, because board members don't really understand how this is going to work. It's sort of out of their experience range, but also skills within the organisation at every level, actually. You know, it's not that AI, I think, is not just going to be about getting rid of people. You know, it's also going to be about enhancing the work that people within an organisation do. So in order to realise that potential, I think we've really got to focus on human capital development much more than we have.
Mm-hmm. And to that point that you just made, I mean, I was discussing with the chairwoman of a company, and they're leading a big digital transformation, you know, based on AI as well. And she was actually making a similar point that you just made. She was basically saying that if this digital transformation and AI transformation is not adopted and supported by the board level, it's never going to work. So I think that's a very critical point. That the board needs to own and sponsor this kind of transformations, right?
I think that's absolutely right, and I do think that I interact with a lot of board members, and there really are some board members out there who still don't get it. They still don't. I mean, yes, the full impact of AI might not occur within the next couple of years. You know, we're still working out how it's going to be rolled out across mainstream business. And I think some people are looking at that and saying, well, there's been all this hype about AI, so AI really is not the big deal that a lot of the people have been saying it is. But I think, again, this is where I think a longer-term perspective is incredibly important. It is incredibly important for board members to understand what the opportunity and also the risks of this new technology is. And if you're not prepared for that, then all of a sudden one day it's going to hit your business.
Thank you. Jen, back to you. So earlier we were discussing about the corporate governance principles when it comes to talent and workforce management. Yes. So I would like to know whether you see a growing consensus, sort of agreed upon principles about how corporate governance can help talent management, or do we still see like fragmentation across the globe, across different countries and regions?
I think, well, it's a good question. And it is in some ways a question that the answer has changed quite a bit in maybe the last 8 weeks or 12 weeks. So I think, broadly speaking, there is quite a lot of consensus that in order to be a successful business, you need to successfully manage your talent, and therefore the board needs to have oversight. There's a lot of cultural difference around the world that kind of drives some of how that happens. So if you look, for example, at what would be a normal career progression in Japan, that's very different than what it might be in the UK or in North America. But at its core, the issues are the same. And interestingly, even with the DEI, whatever you want to call it, acronym of choice debate that we're seeing now, you know, the acronym has become politically toxic in North America, right? That's just true. But the issues haven't become any less material to companies, right? So I think what we'll see is quite a lot of rhetoric change, right? We probably won't use that term anymore. You know, I look after an organization that used to use the term ESG quite a lot. We're not going to use the term ESG anymore in a couple of years either, but it's not going to mean that these aren't important issues that boards need to be focused on. If you lose an acronym to politics, the best thing to do, in my view, let the acronym go. The issue is what matters, right?
Stick to the essence of it.
Right? Like, what is material here? Yeah. This is all really people should be focused on. Mm-hmm. To my business, what is material, and therefore, what do I need to do? And so in many ways, it's actually less of a geography by geography issue than it is a industry by industry issue, right? And so you will see many companies, for example, in the extractive industries, who are absolute global leaders at workforce health and safety, which is exactly what you'd expect, because you don't want people to fall down a mine, for example, or, you know, you don't want factories to blow up. And so they need to be incredibly careful, and they need to be very focused, because these are the absolute material issues for them, and boards tend to be very focused on that. It will tend to be part of executive compensation plans, so it's driving those incentives. Similarly, tech. Well, the tech sector is incredibly focused on talent retention, because if you lose all the coders, you've lost your business, right? So you will find, I think, more focus on what is the right material issue for us. How do we demonstrate that? And how do we cut through all the noise? Because hopefully the company will outlast a current administration anywhere. right? That's the idea. We want these companies to be sustainable and value accretive over the long term. So yeah, we're going to see pendulums swing. We always do, right? We go one way, we go the other way, we come back again with politics. But from running a business, the core issues should stay the same. So I would suggest we'll see the way people talk about this become quite different in different parts of the world. But I hope and would expect as an investor, you know, generally widely invested around the world, that boards will keep their focus on what matters and is material.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking while you were making this comment, in a way, this politicization of these acronyms maybe was kind of a litmus test for some corporations, because as you said, you know, whatever, you know, we can call it DEI, ESG, I think the important thing is that whether the boards truly understand the benefit, the essence of these concepts.
Oh, completely. And how much is it really embedded in your long-term strategy?
Yeah.
Right? Have you got a strategy that fully considers the material impacts and risks that your business has across its supply chain and across its stakeholders? And if you do, you don't need an acronym, because if you do, you're already thinking about all of these issues, right? Because the worst thing is to do something for the sake of it. My previous job, I used to be a head of stewardship in asset management, and we would vote, you know, AGMs, and there was a real trend for a little while of people putting ESG measures into executive compensation plans, largely just with, you know, sensible links to strategy, but every now and again, just mad ones that have clearly just been put in to tick a box to say we've got one, and there's no good governance in that at all. My favorite one I ever saw was not number of women in the leadership team, number of women in the leadership team succession plan. And I said, well, how do you measure that? And they go, oh, we just look at it and count the number of... I said, okay, well, give me a pen. I'll just get your bonus for you. We'll just write 2 extra people on the list, right? This is madness. There's no strategic link there at all. There's no value link there. But there are huge value and strategic links to talent retention, to getting training programs right, to making sure people are safe. You know, and so focusing on what matters is absolutely should be the guiding principle. Thank you.
So Paula, back to you, speaking about what really matters for corporations. Earlier in my opening speech, I mentioned survey results that demonstrates that, you know, most of the companies, they do acknowledge the importance of talent and workforce for their business operations and strategy, but only 1/4 of them do feel and believe that they're fully prepared to address these issues. So from a development finance perspective, what are the risks for the boards of not being fully prepared to address the talent and workforce issues?
Thank you. No, but I think, you know, again, as somebody who does look at the boards quite a bit, I think that the biggest risks are, or let's say the starting risks are really in the board's own ability to deal with risks, to understand the kind of risk context, the risk universe for the company, to see how it's related to the strategy, and to basically, you know, look into that. We also need to ask the question of board composition itself, and there I think, you know, Roger put it beautifully. It's doing what makes sense, which is, you know, less often than what it should be. There I just want to mention two kind of small remarks. First of all, we occasionally are an equity investor as EBRD, and on those occasions we do benefit from a right to nominate a director at the company's board. And this is really something that's especially in recent years, it's taken on a whole new meaning for us, because we're really getting very deeply into examining what kind of skill, what kind of expert profile would be the best possible addition to the board if we were to nominate. And there is a whole, you know, nominee directors function and network within the EBRD that deals with those issues, all with the goal of, you know, trying to add that extra bit of expertise to the board, to make it more effective, and to make it really look into some of these things a bit more deeply, not just on a kind of one-off evaluation, but on an ongoing basis. The second point, I think, you know, we are still very much, as I said, in the, you know, in the need, we see the need to educate the relevant market players about the importance of this issue. And I think this is something that's visible also here in Turkey, where you have huge opportunities in terms of talent, especially female talent that has been kind of overlooked to a great degree. But you have fairly weak refreshment rates at the board. You have fairly low rates of independent directors. You have, you know, very kind of long-term, very stable boards, which is quite a bit at odds with what is happening, with how quickly things are changing and how the boards need to respond. And just as a side note, I think, you know, if you look at the most recent list of top 10 global risks issued by Davos, basically none of them are financial anymore in their kind of immediate nature. They're all to do with AI, with huge polarity in society. So a lot of them are becoming very people related, and that on its own should probably be enough to cause, you know, a rethinking of who do we want to have at the board, who will be capable to deal with these issues. But just on the diversity point, I think, you know, for us, obviously, as an institution, it is very important, and I believe it will continue to be very important because it's the right thing to do from a economic empowerment perspective. It's the right thing to do from a board effectiveness perspective. And just to mention that I think, you know, this is something that we as EBRD have been advocating for quite a long time, especially in Turkey, where we have also, you know, had a joint initiative with many of the organizations represented today on advancing equal representation of women in boardrooms. We have recently issued what we call a nomination toolkit, which is it's almost like a soft guidance for the industry, for nomination processes, on how to structure them, how to translate the strategic needs of the company into something that's like a board profile or a competency matrix, and then govern your future nominations and your board composition planning from there. And I hope that this will be of value to the local market, and also coupled with regulatory changes that are hopefully on the way, that it will really help to move the dial in this space. Obviously, not just for the sake of changing the figures, but for the sake of getting new people, new perspectives on the board who will be assisting the company for the next 5 to 7 years.
And I think your last comment is, I think we need to underline that it's not about, you know, changing the figures and faces on the boards, but also getting new perspectives, because referring back to earlier discussion, of course, there is a growing complexity of issues, and the number of issues and their complexity are increasing over the years. And as Rita said, you know, it's going to increase even more in the near future. So if we don't get new perspectives, and if we don't create that kind of psychological safety and the right values and culture in place, it's going to have a real impact on the business results, I assume, right?
Definitely, and I think, you know, some risks you can only notice once you are actually in the company. You know, there can be things such as the risks of people doing siloed work, such as we've heard on the previous panel, or, you know, different incentives pulling different teams, you know, in different directions in terms of business delivery. There could be risks in restructuring an organization and kind of handling those change management processes. Ultimately, only board members who are really engaged and who are intentional in kind of their efforts to design a good corporate culture can spot those issues and work on them and help the management, obviously, to address them.
Thank you. Back to Roger. So we are talking about the importance of diversity and having multiple perspectives on the boards to deal with the emerging and also the current issues that the companies are facing. So how are the British UK companies are rethinking their board composure? And is there any, you know, benchmarks or examples that you can provide to the audience?
Yes, well, in some respects, there has been a revolution, I would say, you know, over the last 15 years. And that's in terms of one dimension of diversity, and that's gender diversity. You know, so in the UK, Back in 2010, I think, you know, there was something like 10% female participation on the boards of major FTSE 100 companies. It's now well over a third, going up towards 40%. So that's, in some respects, that's an incredible change. It hasn't really percolated to the same degree to the executive level. Mm-hmm. It's still very much a male-dominated world, being a CEO. Still being a chair. Mm-hmm. Other elements of diversity on boards. UK boards are pretty international, I would say, compared to many other countries. That reflects the fact the international ownership of UK listed companies. Something which, you know, there have been other elements of diversity that have been increasingly focused on, or focused on more in the last few years, such as ethnicity within the UK. Is that being reflected on boards? Still doesn't really reflect wider society, I would say, but there's a bit more focus on that now. And age is something else which is increasingly talked about, because especially if we want to take forward this tech revolution, if we want to have people who are tech savvy mm-hmm. on boards, it might be useful to have people who are somewhat younger. And it's still the case the average board member is, even on first appointment, is in his or her late 50s, you know, mm-hmm. So it is quite a certain demographic still very much dominating boards. But ultimately, of course, though, I would say the most important dimension of diversity is what we describe as cognitive diversity. Yes. And that is people thinking in different ways and having a different angle on subjects that is going to lead to better discussions mm-hmm. and better decisions. And that is still, I would say, a challenge. We talk about nowadays this issue of groupthink. Yes. Groupthink is this kind of endemic problem where you have people who are thinking the same. Even though there's a lot of different people around the table, they're actually all thinking in the same way. Uh-huh. And that is still an issue for boards. And maybe it's just part of the human condition. You know, it's very difficult to, unless you're really trying and you're really thinking about it, it's difficult to get away from that. But I think this points us towards the future. To really make boards work well in the future, we're going to have to think much more about board dynamics, behavioural dynamics on the board. Board evaluation processes, I think, can help us think about this. But let's never forget, the board is a group of human beings, and you know, the human dimension on boards, as well as everywhere else, is absolutely crucial.
So that behavioral part of decision-making at the boards is really important, because this group think, the cognitive bias that really prevents, you know, people across the same boards is really important. I remember a Harvard Business case study even about Kennedy's some decision about the military operation and how that was affected by groupthink back at the time. But I think it's time to revisit this kind of case studies even today. But yeah, that's another discussion.
There are many like that. I think you're thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, aren't you?
Yes.
About what happened then, and the Bear Pigs disaster.
Yes.
But thankfully, he made the right decision on that occasion.
Yeah, exactly. So I would like to turn to Raitis yourself. So earlier you mentioned that you served on the boards of various companies, but also served as a CEO. So what are the, from different perspectives, you had the possibility to experience this. So what are the best practices that you have observed so far to make sure that boards and the executive team are able to acquire and retain talent that is really needed for the company to make the best strategic decisions?
Thanks. So maybe I will start with some illustration.
Okay.
Think about and remember the period between 2017 and 2022. How many global or regional events, let's say, that were impacting our business were happening during this period of the year?
Quite a bit.
A lot.
Yeah.
You can name it. And McKinsey is having a so-called organizational health index. They're measuring this index across the globe and so on. And they were making analysis how the total shareholder return is how much value increased. I mean, the share price increased and the dividends paid out. I mean, it's very simple to calculate. So what's the ratio between the organizational health index and the TSR, the total shareholder return? And they made 3 blocks. It's middle quartile, lower quartile, and upper quartile in the terms of the organizational index, health index. So the middle during these years made the TSR of about 14%. You know, keeping in mind that it was very kind of difficult period, it's probably okay. Then this lower quartile made minus 17%. Wow. And what about the upper quartile? I mean, those were that having the kind of best health in organization. I'm just reminding, this was middle, and it was 14. This was 43%. 3 times this middle quartile. So it indicates very clearly that the board first has to think about how to create value for the shareholders using this organizational development tools, because all tools are in the hands and in the minds, of course, of the board. So this is, I believe, that a very kind of good and well presenting example. Then about the attraction and keeping the talent, I can also give some examples when people in the companies, when I was serving as a CEO, one of the top managers were coming to be employed, and I was saying, why are you coming to our company? Because there are so many competitors, and probably they can also pay quite good money. And they say, you know, I heard that it's a good place to work. I said, what do you mean? And they were kind of talking about soft things, not the hard things. So it means that we were able to create some kind of culture that it was kind of speaking, you know, I mean, this knowledge was going through our employees out from the organization, right? There is another example. I was working in the finance sector, and the head of marketing is coming and saying to me, to my room, and saying, I send an email. I'm checking the email. No, I haven't got it. No, I send not to you. I said, so why are you coming to me and saying that you send the email to someone else? Because I sent to our first kind of the most kind of big competitors, and I sent them and said that I am not going to work for them even for plus 30% of the salary. I said, why you didn't take this opportunity? Because I like the way I'm treated here in this company, and I see that all of us, not only me, are treated in this company in that way. So this is much bigger value than some extra euros and so on a month. So I think that is the culture that each CEO or the company should kind of foster. One more thing, I'm always talking when I'm on the board, that we can develop and approve different policies, codes, and in different internal regulations. But if the people will be not right in the organization, these papers will not help us, unfortunately. So Peter Drucker, I believe everyone knows this guru, so he said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I very much agree with that. But there is an extension, the processes for the lunch and the rest for the dinner. So organizational culture, from my perspective, is really very, very, very keen. And a little bit coming back to the board, I believe that the greatest boards are, they have to engage themselves in the 3 important areas. First is smart challenging. It's not just challenge the management in the, let's say, dumb way, but in the smart way, right? Then efficient control. I saw a lot of boards, unfortunately, that they are kind of thinking that their main goal is to control and asking more and more and more and more reports. And reports are creating a lot of value, I believe, yes? No. But I see quite few boards that are doing one more thing that is really vital, valuable support. And when the top management and others, they see that the board is really helping to achieve the either short-term or long-term targets, I mean, doing something like that and really helping the people when they can contribute, the organization also already, understands that, oh, these guys are not just, kicking our ass, but they are really eager to be together with us and to do this, as good as possible. And also the boards, from my perspective, the boards should employ the CEO, that is what is CEO? Chief Officer, what is in the middle? Executive, everyone knows this. No, not anymore. E in the middle is Chief Enabling Officer. It's not about the execution, it's about enabling the whole organization to run that company, to run the operations. The best is when the indication when the CEO is leaving for 2 weeks on vacation and the organization is going full speed without CEO present or not picking up the phone or reading not emails. So I think this is important. Also, how the board can kind of influence directly not only the very top executives in the company but lower ones. So I'm using the kind of practice that we are inviting to the board meetings to present specific topic by the person who is responsible for this function, even though that person is not on the very top on C-level. So of course, for that person, it's a little bit of challenge. I'm going to the board. It's terrible. But we are trying to create the atmosphere in the boardroom that we are really valuing what he or she is doing. We are very interested not only in the report, not only in the function, but in him or her. I mean, as an individual, and even kind of trying to make it kind of easy, kind of going discussion and so on and so on. And after some time, we see that people really accepting us as a board, not as a kind of bad policeman or whoever, but really the real people, real human that really care about every single function, about every single person and so on. There is another side of this invitation to the board meetings, that if we see that someone that is responsible for that particular function is not performing as it or he could be, so we are then having a discussion afterwards with the CEO. That do you think that person is, of course, we are not suggesting to replace that person. So, and in this way, we are helping the CEO to strengthen his team or the kind of responsible persons and so on and so on.
The crew.
So that is also kind of small thing, but it works both ways and so on. Yeah, so maybe that is yeah, and one more maybe example. I'm serving on the board of water management company that is supplying the water and so on, managing the wastewater, and we have a lot of just simple workers, and unfortunately they are not young. They are 45, 50, sometimes even over 50, closer to 60 worker. Can you imagine? I mean, hard work to do physical work. So we insisted as a board that let's develop the program, long-term program, how we are going to replace them. Because it's not that you will put the advertisement, who wants to go, fix this kind of wastewater on the street. And then a lot of youngsters will come, oh, it's my dream job, ha ha ha. No. So how to do this in this smooth way? And it is at least 5 years plan, and so on and so on. And people see that we care about those that are going to leave us soon, and also others see that we are thinking about those that will come and will do the job. And of course, we are thinking about some technology things, but anyway, people will need. So these are
Thank you.
kind of tips. Yeah, thank you.
I would like to thank to all of our panelists for being with us today, sharing experiences, observations, and thoughts. Please join me applauding our panelists. Paula Jurit, Senior Counsel for Corporate Governance, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Thank you. Raitis Ambrovicius, Chairman of ECODA and President of Baltic Institute of Corporate Governance. Roger Baker, Director of Policy and Corporate Governance at the Institute of Directors in the UK, and Jen Sisson, CEO of the International Corporate Governance Network. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all.
Take it quick.
Oh, the picture, yes.
Gerçekten bu kadar kıymetli kurumu, ICGN, EBRD, IOD, ECODE gibi aslında kurumları burada ağırlanması çok önemliydi. Şimdi devam edeceğiz ama öğlen arasından önce sponsorlarımıza destek için teşekkür etmek istiyoruz. Dolayısıyla ben yavaş yavaş onları sahneye çağıracağım. Sonrasında zaten öğle aramız başlayacak. Öğle yemeğimiz 16. Uluslararası Kurumsal Yönetim Zirvesi'nin düzenlenmesinde katkı sağlayan tüm sponsorlarımıza çok teşekkür ediyorum ve ben sırayla sahneye davet etmek istiyorum. Ana sponsorumuz Türkiye Sanayi Kalkınma Bankası adına TSKB kıdemli yöneticisi Aslan Duru'yu sahneye rica ediyoruz alkışlarla. Altın sponsorumuz Sokar. Bugün aramızda yoklar ama kendilerine de çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Yine SÜTAŞ adına sizi sahnede bekletelim biraz. Tüm sponsorlarımız gelecekler. SÜTAŞ adına SÜTAŞ Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Duygu Yılmaz. RAM Sigorta adına Genel Müdür Özlem İlaslan. Aslı Tex'te altın sponsorlarımız arasında ancak kendileri bugün aramızda yoklar. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Panel sponsorlarımız ETİ adına Dijital Pazarlama Direktörü Emir İşleri ve Dijital Pazarlama Müdürü Merve Gül Elagöz'ü sahneye rica ediyoruz. ETİ adına burada olan arkadaşlarımız. Kibar Holding adına Kurumsal İletişim Müdürü Nilüfer Fişek Öker. Deloitte Türkiye adına TKD Denetim Kurulu Başkanı ve Deloitte Türkiye Denetim ve Güvence Hizmetler Ortağı Ali Çiçekli. İkram sponsorlarımız Carrefour'sa Lezzet Arası adına Grup Müdürü Gökhan Fikret Sabuncu. Sağlık sponsorumuz Medikal Park adına sizi şöyle ortaya alabiliriz. Strateji ve Yatırımcı İlişkileri Direktörü Deniz Can Yücel Medikal Park adına. Yaka Kart sponsorumuz UK Experience kurucusu Sayın Uğur Karaboğa ve partner kuruluşumuz Hedef Filo adına Pazarlama Müdürü Özlem Erdem'i sahneye davet ediyoruz. Ben Kaçu Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Profesör Doktor İnci Yıldız'ı da alkışlarla sahneye davet etmek istiyorum. İnci Hanım'ı da alabilirsek sahneye. Çok teşekkürler. Tabii ki hoş geldiniz. Ben hemen size mikrofon vereceğim. Şöyle tabii ki sponsorlarımızın yanına alalım sizi. Bir mikrofon rica edebilir miyiz? Hemen geliyor İnci Hanım. Şöyle siz de ortaya fotoğrafı alalım isterseniz. Ortaya alalım sizi de buyurun. Fotoğraf sonrası da mikrofonu size vereceğim. Sahnede alalım. Ben İnci Hanım'a da mikrofonu vereyim.
Efendim ben değerli iş insanları ve sevgili katılımcılar, bir sivil toplum kuruluşunun yönetim kurulu başkanı olarak buradayım. Ve Türkiye Kurumsal Yönetim Derneği'ne bizi desteklediği için özellikle teşekkür ediyorum. Tüm katılımcılara da aynı şekilde teşekkür ediyorum. Biz 25. yılımızı kutluyoruz. Ama sivil toplum kuruluşları maalesef ülkemizde Avrupa veya Amerika gibi yeterli değeri bulamıyor veya tanınamıyor. Etrafa yeterince duyurulamıyor. Çocuk kanserleri iyileşen hastalıklar ama çok zahmetli tedavileri var. 6 ay, 2 yıl gibi sürelerle hastanede yatıyor çocuklar. İşte bizim vakfımızın misyonu da bu çocukları mutlu etmek. Hastanelere gidiyoruz veya aile evlerimiz var. Onlara oyun odaları yapıyoruz. Özel günlerinde doğum günlerini kutluyoruz. Hastaneye yattıklarında hoş geldin hediyeleri yolluyoruz. 23 Nisan'da, yılbaşında onlarla birlikte o güzel günleri kutluyoruz. Çeşitli aktivitelerle özellikle psikolojik ve sosyal hizmet alanında onlara destek oluyoruz. Birçok çocuğumuza, kanserli çocuğumuza eğitim bursu veriyoruz. Ve birçoğuna da yine maddi destekte bulunuyoruz. Çünkü hepsi hastaneye gelip gidişlerindeki ücreti dahi karşılayamıyor. 2 tane aile evimiz var ve bir umut merkezimiz var. Bu destekleri sağlayan iyiliklere sizlerin de katkılarınızı bekliyoruz.
Ne güzel.
Teşekkür ediyorum.
Çok teşekkürler. Çok
Tüm
teşekkür ediyoruz.
sponsorları da kutluyorum.
Çok sağ olun. Sizi ben biraz daha sahneye tutacağım. Sponsorlarımızı yerlerine alabiliriz. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Ben Tamer Sakay'ı da sahneye davet etmek istiyorum alkışlarla. Tamer Bey'in ödülünü de sizin teslim etmenizi, sertifikasını rica edeceğiz İnci Hanım. Şöyle ortaya alabiliriz sizi de. Buyurun Tamer Bey, size de küçük bir sertifika. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz ve tebrik ediyoruz destekleriniz için tüm STK'lara. 1 saatlik bir öğlen arası, sonra enerjimiz yükseliyor. Çok önemli paneller, konuk konuşmacıları 2. bölümde sizlerle olacak.